Yes, if you look at Job chapter 1, and just real quick, it says, verse number 121 says, "And said, Naked came I out of my mother's womb, and naked shall I return thither. The Lord gave, and the Lord hath taken away. Blessed be the name of the Lord." Amen. Amen. Right. So I didn't just know that off the top of my head. That is my text here tonight. So Job chapter 1, we're going to read verses 9, 10, and 11. Let's do this. I've never done this before. Let's stand and read responsibly. I've never tried that before. It's only 3 verses, so that doesn't leave a whole lot for you. But starting with verse number 9. "Then Satan answered the Lord and said, Doth Job fear God for naught? Hast thou not made an hedge about him, and about his house, and about all that he hath on every side? Thou hast blessed the work of his hands, and his substance is increased in the land. But put forth thine hand now, and touch all that he hath, and he will curse thee to thy face." You can be seated. Dear Heavenly Father, I am so unworthy to stand before your congregation and to open up your word, Lord. But it is an honor to be able to do it. Lord, I pray that you will calm my heart, Lord. Give my lips guidance, Lord, and that you will open up the hearts of the congregation tonight, Lord. These men, these young ladies, these young boys, and help it to be something that benefits them, that blesses their hearts, and something that will allow them to serve you better and more faithfully throughout their lives. In Jesus' name, amen. So if you don't know this story, and I'm not going to just take for granted that everybody knows the story of Job, we're going to go through some of the background fundamentals of it. And if you were just reading this so far, you only know a couple things about Job. You know that he was a guy that feared God, and you know that Satan wanted to get behind his fence. And that's really all that you know about him so far. Guy feared the Lord, Satan wanted to get behind his fence. But I can't take for granted that everyone's familiar with Job, so I'm going to briefly run through some context to make sure everybody's aware. There's some fundamental things you need to know in order to follow tonight. So I'm going to read verses 1 through 5. "There was a man in the land of Uz whose name was Job, and that man was perfect and upright, and one that feared God and eschewed evil. And there were born unto him 7 sons and 3 daughters. His substance also was 7,000 sheep, 3,000 camels, 500 yoke of oxen, and 500 she-asses, and a very great household. So this man was the greatest of all the men of the east. And his sons went and feasted in their houses, every one his day, and sent and called for their 3 sisters to eat and drink with them. And it was so, when the days of their feasting were gone about, that Job sent and sanctified them, and rose up early in the morning, and offered burnt offerings, according to the number of them all. For Job said, It may be that my sons have sinned and cursed God in their hearts. Thus Job did continually." So meet Job. Here's what you know about him. For those of you keeping score, Job right now is an honorable man. He is a family man. Amen. He was a successful man. Amen. He was wealthy, but he was wealthy in kind of not like a I hate you because you're so rich kind of way, but like a entrepreneurial kind of way. He was a working man. We know that because he wasn't rich in gold and silver and chariots, right? He was rich in cattle and yoke of oxen. You know, what were yoke of oxen good for? You know, it wasn't dealing, it was working, right? So he was a working man, and he was a successful working man. He had 500 she-asses, and so you know he had his work cut out for him because females are always the more difficult ones to deal with. He had a great household, unlike mine is going to be now that I realize my wife did not go sit with the ladies in the other. But he didn't just have a great house, he had a great household. His house was great because the people in it made it great. Amen. He had a great household. In verses 6 through 10, we read that Job's faithfulness caught the attention of heaven. Amen. I'm going to read those verses right now. "Now there was a day when the sons of God came to present themselves before the Lord, and Satan came also among them. And the Lord said unto Satan, Whence comest thou? Then Satan answered the Lord and said, From going to and fro in the earth, and from walking up and down in it. And the Lord said unto Satan, Hast thou considered my servant Job, that there is none like him in the earth, a perfect and upright man, one that feareth God and escheweth evil? Then Satan answered the Lord and said, Doth Job fear God for naught? Hast not thou made an hedge about him, and about his house, and about all that he hath, on every side? Thou hast blessed the work of his hands, and his substance is increased in the land. But put forth thine hand now, and touch all that he hath, and he will curse thee to thy face. Job's faithfulness caught the attention of heaven.
Amen.
But Job also experienced great trials, and that's really what Job is known for, is his trials. The name Job is almost synonymous with someone going through great trials. But there's more that we can learn from Job than just great trials, and that we'll go through great trials. Because God referred to him as a perfect and upright man. And God referred to him as a perfect and upright man before he ever faced his trials. So there must have been things about Job's life that we can learn more than just his trials.
Amen.
So we're going to do a little character study of who Job was and understand what made him a perfect and upright man, and why does that matter to us today. His great trials, just in case you're not familiar with them, real quickly, if you read through this chapter and the following chapter, we'll see that in one day, various servants show up one at a time, and they tell him that his substance and his servants have all been slain until there are none that remain. You'll see that fire seemingly comes from heaven and destroys his sheep. You'll see that in the same day, in verses 18 and 19, and these need to be read and not really summarized. Verses 18 and 19, it says, "While he was yet speaking, there came also another and said, Thy sons and thy daughters were eating and drinking wine in their eldest brother's house. And behold, there came a great wind from the wilderness, and smote the four corners of the house, and it fell upon the young men, and they are dead. And I only am escaped to tell thee." He lost his family. He lost all of his substance. He lost what would seem like everything that he had in one day. And then the following that, there was another day that comes along, and his flesh is stricken also, and he becomes leprous. We see that in verses 7 and 8 in the following chapter, where it says, So went Satan forth from the presence of the Lord, and smote Job with sore boils from the sole of his foot unto his crown. And he took him a potsherd to scrape himself withal, and he sat down among the ashes. So this great man, we see him in just a few verses later, we see him sitting among the ashes, scraping himself, and he's lost everything. Well, why do we care? Well, everything that happens to Job seems really alarming to us because we see it happens in the span of just a few verses. But what we need to realize is that the trials of Job will be the trials of us if we live long enough to experience them.
Yeah.
They may not all happen to us in the series of 2 verses. You might right now be living in the time of verses 1 through 5, where you're saying everything is going great for me right now. But there is going to be a verse 6 that comes along in your life.
Amen.
There's going to be a verse 6 that comes along where it says, now there was a day. One day you're going to say, hey, I was completely healthy, but then there was this day where I wasn't. Everything was going wonderful in my house, and then there was this day where it wasn't. Everything was going great for me financially, and then something happened, and then all of a sudden, it wasn't anymore. There was this one day that came along. If that hasn't happened to you yet, then maybe you're still living in verses 1 through 5.
Yeah.
But every one of us will live long enough to die. Every one of us will experience the loss of people that we love. Every one of us will have failing health if we live long enough to do so. Every one of us will go through financial and professional and personal difficulties. And so we need to know about a guy that God called upright and perfect, and who eschewed evil. So now that we know the background of him, who was he? If he was just more than just a proverb about loss, then who was he? Verse number 1 tells us that he was perfect and upright. So God doesn't call somebody perfect and upright for no reason. At this point, it's not his response to his trials that God called him perfect and upright. He called him perfect and upright through observation of Job's life to that point. He must have observed Job and realized that Job was an upright man. In every decision to be upright, there is an opportunity to be dishonest.
Amen.
Right.
You can't make an upright decision without having been a dishonest option that you could have chosen but you didn't choose. So his trials and temptations really don't start in verse 13 of Job chapter 1. He faced temptations the way that any man would, and the way that every man does, and he was pronounced here to be upright. He wasn't just an upright man. It says that he feared God. It was stated of Job that he feared God for the same reason, because he had shown that he feared God.
Yes.
He showed that he feared God by how he treated sin. He understood sin's penalty. You say, well, Brother Chris, you're speculating. I'm not speculating. He understood what sin's penalty was. Look at verse number 5, and you'll see that it was so when the days of their feasting were going about, that Job sent and sanctified them and rose up early in the morning and offered burnt offerings for them. Now, we've gotten so desensitized to what a sacrifice is, we forget how gruesome the process actually was for a sacrifice.
Yeah.
But Job would have understood if he offered himself burnt offerings unto the number of his kids, and if you, by account he had 10 that are listed, then he would have offered burnt offerings for 10 different animals that he would have had to slay, drain the blood, and then he would have to destroy their body by fire until it was gone. And he would look at that, and he would understand that that was sin's penalty. And he would understand that that blood had to be shed for sin, because he was trying to atone for the sins of his children, even ones that he didn't know about. He understood the penalty for sin. You know, it's remarkable. Sometimes I think that we don't really understand sin's penalty day because we don't have to witness something like that. You know, people say that if you ever see how sausage is made, you'll never eat sausage again, right? There's a video out that shows you how sausage is made. Have you seen it? Yeah, neither have I, because I want to keep eating sausage, right? But I imagine if you had gone through an animal sacrifice and you had seen it and watched it, then you would understand, wow, the gravity of what that was. And I doubt that you would have left that unmoved by what had just taken place. That process, the slaying, the killing, you know, that's a picture of our future if we die in our sin.
Amen.
Death and then destruction by fire eternally. And it's remarkable. You know, I bet you that there never was a time where somebody walked up to an altar with a priest and they had their atonement goat with them, and they walk over there and they get ready to hand it to the priest, and the priest walks over and he's got his knife ready to get ready to spread the blood, and the guy goes, hold on a second. I really don't want to accept that goat sacrifice. I think that I would rather pay my own sin debt. You ever imagine that happening? You ever imagine seeing what the penalty for sin is? And someone walking up and saying, wait a minute right there, that's really not who I am as a person. I think that I just want to pay for my own sin. And the priest would say, oh, okay, well, hop onto the altar, I guess. You know, I mean, and you know, we'll slay you and then burn you, and then there'll be nothing left of you. You know, I imagine that probably never happened. So is it any less ridiculous now that when there is a sin debt that has been paid for, that anyone would come today and say, hey, you know what, I don't want that for my atonement. When you think about it that way, when you think about what the sacrifice really was, and if you watched it and if you would have seen it, and if you picture it, what the penalty and the payment for your sin was, how can you do anything but fall down on your knees in appreciation for what God has done for you and say, yes, Lord, I want that. I want that. And you have a feeling that if we'll be faithful in telling that, then other people will feel the same way. So Job was a good man. Job was a man who was upright. He was a man who was perfect. He feared God. He understood the penalty for sin. He was a good man in part because of how he treated sin, but also because of how he treated evil. It says that he eschewed evil. That's eschewed. That's a word you don't want to try and say for the first time before you're preaching. I've practiced it at home a few times. I still have a hard time saying the word eschewed. But the word eschewed, it means to shun, to flee from, to avoid. That's how he treated sin. That's how he treated evil. He would run away from it. He would flee it. You know, you can't eschew evil if you're running towards it.
Amen.
If you know where it's taking place, if you know where the sin is taking place and you're running there, there's no way you can flee it.
Amen.
You're not running from the sin, you're running towards the sin. And I think every one of us, probably if we examine our lives and we examine our hearts, we'll see that we know where that place is for us. It's the place where we know sin is going on. And it's the place that God has convicted our hearts before, saying that, you know, we ought to avoid that place. We ought to avoid those people. We ought to avoid that office in our work building where that conversation is going on.
Amen.
We ought to avoid those friends if you're a young person. And you have those friends, but they're fun to be around and you enjoy them, but they're the ones that you ought to be running from, not running towards.
Right. Amen.
If you want it to be said of you through your trials that you were a servant of God, that you eschewed evil, then you have to flee sin. You can't run towards it. You got to run away from it. God knew that Job had eschewed evil because he had demonstrated it before God. Before his trials ever took place, he had demonstrated before God that he was a man who hated sin. A man who would flee from it, who would run from it. Demonstrating, what would demonstrating it look like? I think that for me, when I picture someone who hates something, I picture one of my daughters when I try to feed her something she doesn't like. And in the response, and they're hiding over there now because they know that I'm talking about them. But when you try to force them into eating something they don't like, you can tell they don't like it. There is no wondering, hey, how do you feel about dinner tonight? How do you feel about those onions? You know, you can tell on their faces they are doing anything they can to avoid it. If you don't have a kid, that's no problem. If you have a dog and he doesn't like water and you've tried to drag him to the bathtub before, then you can see he is resisting something that he hates. It takes great effort. He's not going to accidentally get into that water. You're going to have to force him in there to do it. If you don't have a dog, then just picture your cat and imagine any time you tried to get it to do anything ever. Because everyone knows that cats just eschew obedience, and so that's what they hate. They flee obedience. Interestingly enough, if you've seen a cat with a hairball, you've seen what it looks like when I try to feed my kids things that they don't like. So it all comes back around, all works together. So he was a man who eschewed evil. He feared God. He was an upright man, and he was a family man. Job was a great father. He was a great father. There might not be very many verses about it, but those verses that are written say a lot about the father that Job was.
Amen.
He was a great father in the way that he brought up his children. How do I know? I know that because of how his children acted. His children, in verse number 4, it says that his sons went and feasted in their houses. So his kids moved out and started eating out of their own refrigerators. They had their own houses to go to, right? So success as a parent, right? Your kids move out, they're not in your fridge anymore, you're a successful parent. That's check block number one. They're out, they're not mooching off of you anymore. So they moved out, but they also, they loved each other. The brothers and sisters loved each other. You can see that in how they took care of each other. They didn't forget about each other. Every single one of them did their part in taking care of their siblings. That doesn't happen accidentally in a family.
Right.
That takes a lot of effort. It takes a lot of hard work to raise your children in a way that honors God. It takes a lot of reminding your kids that that's their sister, that that's their, well, not their little brother, he's too young at this point, but that's their family, that they ought to love one another. It doesn't happen accidentally. It takes a lot of work to do that. Every one of them, in his day, they worked well together. They were organized. Everyone on his day had their sisters over to his place. Every single one of them was successful enough to provide for that meal. Every single one of them cared enough to be willing to go through the effort to do it. Every single one of them provided out of their own pocket. There wasn't a single moocher or out of the bunch. Every single one of them took care of it. So Job must have been a great father.
Yeah.
Raising children like Job's wouldn't have been easy. It requires effort, patience, it requires grit. You're challenged and you're tested and you're overwhelmed. 3 days in a row now, Thomas, my son, 8 months old now, he has tested us every night for 3 nights straight. Us every night because I'm home at night. Camille every day because she's home during the day as well. He just started he just started crawling this week, and we have a furnace over on the side of the house, and we want to teach him to stay away from the furnace. So it's the only place that he's not allowed to go, so it's the only place that he wants to go. He crawls over there, and he gets over there, and you'll say, Thomas, stop, no. And he'll look up, and he'll go, and then he raises his hand, and he puts a finger towards where he's going to go. And I said, don't do it. Don't do it. And I'll go over there, and he'll grab it, and I'll take him and pull him away and pop his hand a little bit, and I'll look over at Camille to see if I hit him too hard. But it'll do it again and again and again. And we're trying to get some rest, and we can't get any rest because it takes so much effort to teach him. And I'll get up, and I'll put him back down. He'll crawl right back over to it. He'll put his hand up there and look at me and smile. And when he sees me, he knows what he's doing wrong. Because I get up and go towards him, and before I can get there, he goes and touches it as many times as he can before I can get there to stop him because he knows I'm ready to pull him away from it again. It takes a lot of effort. It takes hard work to raise your children in a way that honors you, to be obedient. And Job did that. Job's children turned out great. And that means that he was a good dad.
Amen.
But he wasn't just a great father in how he raised his children. He was a great father in how he prayed for his children. If I want to raise my children to be a man of God, if I want to raise my son to be a man of God, my will is going to have to be stronger than his will.
Amen.
I'm going to have to be willing to put in that work. I'm going to have to be willing to pray for my children the way that Job prayed for his children. You see in verse number 5, it says that he rose up early every morning and went to the altar for his kids. He rose up early every single morning and went to the altar for his kids. And if you're not rising up early on behalf of your children, then you ought to be. And I'm going to stop right there and say it again. If you're not rising up early and going to the altar for your children, then you should be. And I'm talking to you, Chris Faulkner. That's who ought to be doing it. Your kid's life is too important to sleep through it. You got to build that wall.
Yeah.
You got to put that hedge up. You got to make sure that they're protected. You have to intercede on their behalf. You have to go to God and you have to plead for your children.
Amen.
You have to do it early in the morning. Proverbs 24:30 says it like this: I went by the field of the slothful, and by the vineyard of the man void of understanding. And lo, it was all grown over with thorns, and nettles had covered the face thereof, and the stone wall thereof was broken down. Then I saw and considered it well. I looked upon it and received instruction. Yet a little sleep, a little slumber, a little folding of the hands to sleep. So shall thy poverty come as one that traveleth, and thy want as an armed man. That's the picture of a man who allowed his wall to crumble. And if we'll sleep through it, if we don't wake up and go to the altar for our children, then we're going to allow our wall to crumble because we were too lazy to ever take care of it. And all it takes is the one little crack. If you allow the enemy in one crack, and this is the mistake that I make, it's a mistake I'm sure other Christians make, you think, well, that's just a little area in my life. Well, listen, once the enemy is inside the gates, he's inside the gates. He doesn't care how he got in. He has free reign now. He has free access to anything in your life that he wants to get to. Because you let the wall crumble. Because a little rest, a little sleep, a little folding of the hands. You folded your hands and you put them next to your face and you went to sleep. You folded your hands, you put them behind your head, and you rested and you didn't get out of bed and you didn't pray for your kids. Your kid's life's too important to sleep through it. He rose up and he went early to the altar for his children, and he prayed according to the number of them all. According to their number, that's how he prayed. This wasn't a lazy, generic prayer that Job prayed for his kids. He prayed a specific prayer for them by name. He interceded for each one of them. And I'll put my daughters in bed every night and I'll find myself closing the door and saying, God, please keep my kids safe. God, please take care of my daughters. God, thank you for my kids. Please keep them safe. Please watch over them. You know, I guess that's better than nothing, maybe. But that's a lazy, generic prayer at best. What I need to do, what you need to do, men, I'm talking mostly to men in here, is you need to pray for your children by name. You just say, God, I know that my children are going through this. I know that my daughter is dealing with this right now. I pray for her to be safe as she grows. I pray for her to be pure. I pray for her in her patience. I pray for her in her school. I pray for her in her dealings. And if I don't have time to do that at night, I need to do it in the morning. If I don't have time to do it in the morning, I need to do it at night. But I need to not be a lazy man who's going to allow my wall to crumble down and let Satan in to come and try and attack my family. And you don't either. So why do we care about any of this? Again, maybe this isn't you. Maybe you're not struggling with anything. Maybe you haven't faced any of the trials that Job has faced. But there's a verse 6 coming. Now there was a day. There was a day when something happened. Verse number 6 tells us that God asked Satan where he had been. Satan said, from going to and fro in the earth and from walking up and down in it. He was walking about, seeking whom he may devour. What was he doing? What was he doing through the earth? Was he backpacking through Europe? Is he vacationing, sightseeing? What was he doing? Was he on a Carnival cruise line? No, he wasn't. He wasn't going to and fro through the earth to hang out and sightsee. He was going to and fro through the earth. What was he doing? He was checking fences, is what he was doing. He was checking hedges. How did he know? How did he know in verse number 10 that that hedge was there on every side? You know, you can see a fence. There's only one way you know if it goes all the way around. And that's if you check it at every point. He's roaming around that fence at every single point, checking to find any way in that he can. He said, you made a hedge about him and about his house and about all that he hath. On every side, he had done his work trying to find a way in. He's walking around seeking whom he may devour. And no doubt through his to and fro, he found some lazy man's wall that was covered in vines. It was broken down, and he devoured that family. And God said, have you considered my servant Job?
Amen.
Every one of us will experience the trials that Job faced one day. Financial struggles, personal losses, failures of our health, loss of loved ones. You know, no one escapes life alive. It's appointed unto man once to die, and after that the judgment. The experiences of Job will one day be your experiences. What will the testimony be of your life when you face them? Will God be able to look down at you and say, have you considered my servant who's upright, who hates evil? What will the testimony of heaven? Who will get honor from your life in heaven when heaven is watching?
Yes.
When you're going through those things. In the end, Job declares to God, I have heard of thee by the hearing of the ear, but now mine eye seeth thee. And so the Lord blessed the latter end of Job more than his beginning. Job's story finishes strong. How will yours finish?